I woke up with a jolt, heart pounding. The house was silent, but there was a strange sense that I wasn't alone. The early morning light filtered through the half-drawn curtains, casting a grayish glow that usually brought a sense of calm. But this morning, everything felt off. My husband had already left for work. His early mornings were routine by now, and the house was usually empty for a few hours before I'd hear the shuffling footsteps of his brother, who'd recently moved in. I always kept our bedroom door closed, but today it was ajar, just slightly, as if someone had peeked in and left it that way. I sat up, feeling a mixture of curiosity and something less comfortable, something unsettling. I forced myself to breathe, shaking off the feeling, but as I slipped out of bed, the chill in the room lingered, sticking to my skin like morning dew. I headed downstairs, drawn by the faint clink of a mug being set down on the kitchen counter. There he was. My husband's brother, seated at the kitchen island, back hunched as he stared into his coffee. He looked up and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved, like we were caught in some invisible web that held us both still. He gave me a faint smile, the kind that barely reached his eyes. He looked different this morning. Not just tired, but something else I couldn't quite place. I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had started to feel necessary. As if he filled some empty space in this house, and by extension, in me. He had this silent, almost magnetic presence. A sharp contrast to my husband, whose energy was always focused outward, on work, on ambition, on everything but the life he'd built here with me. Coffee? His voice cut through the silence. Gentle but enough to make my pulse quicken. I nodded, stepping closer. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug he passed me, letting the heat seep into my fingers. As I took a sip, I felt his eyes on me, a kind of watchful curiosity that I couldn't quite define. Did you sleep well? He asked, leaning back slightly, his gaze steady, unflinching. It was such a simple question, but the way he asked it, like he genuinely wanted to know, caught me off guard. I shrugged, feeling a hint of self-consciousness under his gaze. More or less, I replied, glancing away, trying to hide the unease that had settled in my chest since I'd woken up. I was used to going through my mornings quietly, alone, but his presence broke that silence in a way that was oddly comforting. He didn't say much else, just sipped his coffee, his eyes drifting over the room before returning to me. I could feel him watching, as if he was piecing together parts of me I didn't even know were visible. His silence felt both calming and unsettling, as if he understood too much without me having to say a word. I busied myself around the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling, but my mind kept returning to the open bedroom door. Had he been near? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He noticed, his eyebrows lifting in a silent question. But I turned away, not willing to address the strange thoughts running through my mind. As the minutes passed, the silence grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on both of us. And in that silence, I found myself wondering about him, about the life he led before coming here. My husband rarely spoke of his brother's past. They were close, but seemed to avoid delving into each other's personal lives. I only knew bits and pieces, fragments of a life lived in distant places, away from family, away from roots. There was an unspoken sadness to him, a kind of lostness that felt too familiar. Maybe that was why I'd found myself drawn to him, almost against my will. Lost in thought, I barely noticed him standing up, the scrape of the stool pulling me back to the present. He moved closer, so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, his presence filling the small kitchen space. I could smell the faint scent of his aftershave, a warm, earthy scent that felt comforting and strange at the same time. My pulse quickened, but I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, though my fingers had started trembling. As he brushed past me to reach for something on the counter, our arms touched, just briefly. It was such a small, ordinary contact, but it sent a shiver through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I glanced up, reading his eyes. There was a flicker of something there. Curiosity. Maybe even a question that neither of us dared to voice. The silence grew taut, like a string pulled too tightly, ready to snap at any moment. I felt my heart pounding, and for a split second, I let myself wonder what it would be like to step just a little closer, to cross that invisible line that had held us apart. My mind raced, torn between the familiarity of the life I'd built with my husband and the unsettling, intoxicating possibility of something new. Then, without warning, he leaned forward, his face inches from mine. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze, a question I wasn't sure I could answer. I could feel his breath, warm and close. And in that split second, something inside me stirred, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Before I knew what was happening, our lips brushed, a gentle, fleeting touch that was over almost as soon as it began, but it was enough. I pulled back, heart pounding, a flush rising in my cheeks. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I felt a mix of shock and something dangerously close to exhilaration. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the unspoken words hanging between us, thickening the air around us. My hands were shaking as I stepped back, clutching my mug like it could anchor me to reality. I couldn't stay in the same room, couldn't let myself linger under his gaze a moment longer. Without a word, I turned and walked out, feeling his eyes follow me as I left. The weight of what had just happened settled over me like a shroud, both terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The days passed slowly, each one stretching into the next, but the feeling from that morning lingered, refusing to fade. I tried to busy myself with chores, with errands, anything to drown out the memory of that fleeting, forbidden moment. Yet, no matter how hard I tried, his presence haunted me. A shadow that seemed to cling to the corners of every room, filling the quiet spaces he left behind. I found myself paying attention to things I never had before. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the way his voice carried just slightly over the hum of the television, the distinct scent that lingered after he left a room. Every moment he was near felt charged, as though we were two magnets drawn inexplicably together. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking everything. But my mind betrayed me, replaying that split-second connection over and over again. One evening I was tidying up the living room when he entered, his gaze landing on me with that same intensity I'd felt before. He asked if I'd like to join him for a cup of tea, his voice soft but laced with something that felt almost like a challenge. I hesitated but nodded, as if my response was beyond my control. We ended up on the back patio, where a faint breeze rustled the leaves and filled the silence between us. The stars hung low, pinpricks in the night sky, and I found myself speaking without thinking, telling him small things about myself, things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. He listened closely, his expression thoughtful, as if he could sense the weight of the words left unspoken. When he spoke, his voice was warm, gentle, and kind. Yet there was a certain tension in his tone, like he too was navigating an invisible line he didn't want to cross. We sat there, wrapped in a comfortable silence, both of us hesitant to move, as if one small gesture could shatter everything. His eyes held mine, lingering just a little too long, and I could feel my resolve wavering. I felt both liberated and terrified, a paradox I couldn't escape. I realized at that moment that he had started to fill a void I hadn't even known existed, and it scared me. He glanced down, almost as if he was aware of the effect he had on me, then lifted his eyes to mine again. The way he looked at me, like he could see straight into the parts of myself I kept hidden, made my pulse race. His gaze held a quiet confidence, a kind of understanding I wasn't prepared for. I felt my breath catch as he leaned in just a little. His face so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the tension between us palpable. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his words hanging in the air between us. I swallowed, unable to find the right response. There was so much truth in his question that I felt like I'd been stripped bare, as if he'd somehow sensed the emptiness I carried around every day, the loneliness I tried to ignore. Sometimes, I murmured, my voice hardly audible. I tried to look away, but his gaze held me in place, and I felt myself nod. a silent admission of everything I'd been denying. We were standing at the edge of something dangerous, a line that, once crossed, couldn't be undone. As he reached out, his hand brushed against mine, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through me. The rational part of my mind screamed for me to pull away, but I couldn't. I was rooted in place, captivated by the intensity of his gaze, the feeling that he could see right through me. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to break the spell, but words failed me. In that moment, everything around us faded into the background. The air was thick with anticipation, and I felt the weight of his unspoken question hanging in the air like a silent dare. Slowly, he leaned in, his lips hovering close to mine, his breath warm against my skin. I knew I should stop, that this was a step too far, but my resolve crumbled under the force of his presence. Our lips met in a brief, tentative kiss, a quiet, fleeting moment that left me breathless. It was barely a touch, yet it carried with it the weight of everything unsaid, everything we'd been holding back. I pulled away, heart pounding, feeling both exhilarated and filled with a sudden, overwhelming sense of guilt. As I looked into his eyes, I saw a flicker of uncertainty, as if he too felt the enormity of what had just happened. We both knew this wasn't something we could ignore, that the line we just crossed would linger between us, no matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise.
I should go.
I whispered, my voice barely steady. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and I turned, feeling his gaze follow me as I left, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Back inside, I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew, deep down, that everything had changed. Days slipped by in a haze, but that moment on the patio with him stayed with me, lingering like a song I couldn't get out of my head. Every corner of the house felt charged with the memory, an invisible pull that seemed to guide me back to him, even when I tried to keep my distance. Each time I heard his footsteps, each time his voice echoed through the rooms, I felt that familiar rush, that electric current sparking through the air whenever we were near. I tried to ignore it, tried to distract myself with a daily routine, but nothing felt the same. Even the ordinary parts of my life, cooking, cleaning, simple conversations, seemed dull and lifeless in comparison to the way I felt when I was with him. My husband's words became background noise, something I heard but didn't truly listen to. All I could think about was him and the way he made me feel like I was finally awake. One evening, as I stood by the kitchen sink, washing dishes with the monotonous rhythm that had become second nature, I heard him approach. He leaned against the counter, watching me quietly, his gaze both comforting and unsettling. I glanced over at him, trying to hide the smile that was threatening to break free. "Do you ever get tired of it all?" he asked, his tone soft but filled with an understanding I hadn't found in anyone else. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. It was a question that reached deep inside me, pulling at the thoughts and emotions I'd kept hidden even from myself. I paused, turning the question over in my mind. Sometimes, I admitted, surprised at my own honesty. Sometimes it feels like I'm just here, like I'm a part of everything, but not really living any of it. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, and I felt a strange relief at the confession. He nodded, as if he'd known exactly what I meant, and something inside me softened. I looked away, embarrassed, yet somehow comforted. It was rare for someone to listen without judgment, to simply let me speak without expecting an explanation. I'd always felt the need to be composed, to appear put together. But with him, I felt free from that burden. "You know," I said softly, almost to myself, "with you, I feel alive. Like all the little things mean something again." The admission slipped out before I could hold it back, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, but he didn't say anything. Just watched me with that quiet intensity, letting my words hang in the air between us. The room fell into a gentle silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, like I'd found a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. I didn't have to pretend with him, didn't have to hide behind the routine or the quietness. I felt free, in a way I couldn't explain, and that thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Suddenly, he took a step closer, close enough that I could feel his warmth. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face, his touch gentle but filled with an unspoken depth that left me breathless. I didn't need words to understand what he was saying. It was there, in his gaze, in the way his fingers lingered just a moment too long, in the softness of his expression. And then, just as before, our lips met. It was a quiet, unhurried kiss, but one that left me feeling like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. I felt my defenses crumble, felt that fragile wall I'd built around myself shatter under the weight of that simple touch. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely present, completely alive. When he pulled away, we stayed close, our foreheads almost touching, neither of us willing to break the silence. I knew that what we'd done was wrong, that it would have consequences. But in that moment, I didn't care. For once, I let myself simply exist, without the guilt or the worry. I was tired of pretending, tired of feeling numb, and with him, I felt real. As we stood there, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the calm. My heart stopped, reality crashing down on me like a wave. My husband was home, and the delicate illusion we'd created came crashing down in an instant. We both froze, our breaths shallow, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. And I took a shaky step back, putting distance between us as quickly as I could manage. I could feel the blood rushing to my cheeks, the familiar prickle of shame settling in. My husband's footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each passing second, and I felt a rush of panic, my mind racing for an excuse, an explanation. The door opened and my husband stepped into the room, glancing between us with a puzzled expression. I forced a smile, hoping it looked natural. But my pulse was racing and I could feel the tension lingering in the air. He didn't seem to notice, just gave me a tired nod before heading upstairs, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. As soon as he was out of earshot, I turned to face him, my heart still pounding. We can't do this," I whispered, my voice barely steady. But even as I said the words, I knew they held no real conviction. I could still feel his touch, still taste the lingering sweetness of that kiss, and a part of me knew I couldn't walk away. Not anymore. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable. And for a moment I thought he might say something, anything, to reassure me. But he stayed silent, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness that only deepened my own turmoil. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between us. But the sound of my husband's footsteps on the stairs stopped me cold. The moment was over. The fragile connection we'd shared slipping through my fingers like sand. But as I turned away, retreating back into the familiarity of my everyday life, I knew that something had changed. Something irreversible. The days after that moment in the kitchen were a tangled blur of guilt and longing. I could barely look at myself in the mirror without feeling a pang of shame. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase that night from my mind. Couldn't shake the feeling of being alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was like he'd woken something up in me, something I hadn't even realized was missing. I tried to go back to the routine, clinging to the comfort of familiar rituals, hoping they'd ground me. My husband was wrapped up in work, as usual, barely noticing the turmoil that raged beneath my surface. I went about my day, wearing the mask of the devoted wife, smiling, nodding, responding where necessary. But every so often, I'd feel his brother's gaze on me, that quiet, steady presence that was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands pulled me deeper into a place I wasn't sure I could return from. One evening, I was in the living room sorting through the stack of books that had gathered dust on the shelf. My husband had left for an overnight business trip, and the house felt emptier than usual, the silence pressing down on me. I'd been dreading the quiet, the moments when my thoughts had nowhere to hide. I busied myself with anything I could find, anything that might distract me from the growing ache that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my chest. As I reached for another book, his brother appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room with a familiar tension. I glanced up, our eyes meeting, and for a moment, neither of us moved. It was as if the silence between us held all the unspoken words, the confessions we were both too afraid to voice. He took a step closer, hesitating as though he was weighing every possible consequence. And then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone soft but filled with an understanding that made it impossible to brush him off. There was something about the way he asked, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in so long. My husband cared for me, I knew that. But there was a distance between us, a barrier built of years of routine and unspoken expectations. But his brother, he looked at me like he actually wanted to know, like he cared about the answer. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words tangled in my throat. I didn't know how to answer him. Didn't know how to explain the storm of emotions that raged inside me. Finally, I just shook my head, feeling a lump form in my throat. We took another step forward, close enough that I could feel his warmth, and suddenly, the dam broke. "I don't know how to do this anymore," I murmured, my voice barely audible, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. It felt strange to admit it, to let those words see the light. But there was something freeing about the honesty. For so long, I'd been holding it all inside, pretending that everything was fine, that I was fine. But the truth was, I'd been drifting, caught in a life that felt more like an obligation than a choice. He didn't say anything, just nodded, a quiet understanding in his gaze that made me feel exposed, but somehow safe. I could feel the weight of his attention, the way he seemed to drink in every word, every gesture, as if he was memorizing this moment, and as we stood there, I realized that I didn't want him to leave, didn't want the comfort of his presence to disappear. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing against his, and for a moment we both froze. His fingers closed around mine, a simple touch that held more meaning than any words could. My heart raced, and I felt the walls I'd so carefully built around myself begin to crumble. It was terrifying, this feeling of vulnerability, but it was also exhilarating. Like stepping to the edge of a cliff and daring to look down, he squeezed my hand gently, a reassurance, and I felt a rush of warmth spread through me. I wanted to tell him everything, to explain the emptiness, the loneliness, the longing that had built up over years of pretending. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized that he already knew. He could see it all, the cracks and the fractures, the places where I'd broken and put myself back together. In that moment, words felt unnecessary. I didn't need to explain myself. He understood. The silence between us was filled with everything we couldn't say, everything we wanted but couldn't have. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on us, binding us together in a way that felt both beautiful and impossible. We stood there, wrapped in the quiet tension that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I knew it was wrong. Knew that I was walking a dangerous line, but I couldn't bring myself to care. In his presence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt alive. It was like he'd reignited a spark within me, a flame that had long since gone out. And I knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. The silence stretched, thick and charged, until he finally broke it, his voice low and filled with a quiet resolve. Maybe we both deserve more than this, his words hung in the air, a quiet echo of the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a way out, a way to escape the life that had become a cage. But before I could respond, a loud noise shattered the stillness, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, tires crunching over gravel. My heart stopped. A wave of panic crashing over me as reality snapped back into place. My husband wasn't supposed to be home until the next day. What was he doing back so soon? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding, and I felt my stomach drop. We were standing too close, the intimacy of the moment hanging heavy in the air. I could feel the weight of his hand in mine. The warmth that had been so comforting only seconds ago now felt like a burning brand. I pulled my hand back, stepping away, my heart pounding in my chest. My husband's footsteps echoed from the entryway, each step a reminder of the line we'd crossed. I felt the blood drain from my face as I tried to steady myself, to wipe away the traces of the moment we just shared. As my husband walked into the room, I forced a smile, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension that lingered in the air, the way my pulse raced beneath the surface. He looked between us, his brow furrowing slightly, but he said nothing, just gave me a nod before heading upstairs. The moment was over, the fragile bubble we'd created shattered by reality. I turned to look at him, my heart heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. And as he slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts, I knew that I was standing at a crossroads, one I could no longer ignore. I spent the following days in a fog, going through motions that felt mechanical, as if I'd forgotten how to live my own life. Everything had changed, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. My husband seemed unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. He continued, as always, moving through the house like a ghostly reminder of what we once were, though I barely recognized the life we'd built together. I caught glimpses of his brother in those days, passing through hallways, his shadow flitting across the rooms, a presence I couldn't ignore. Every shared glance held a silent acknowledgement of the things we couldn't say. Each unspoken word hung between us like a weight we were both too afraid to lift. And yet, I felt a pull towards him, one I couldn't resist, even as it threatened to consume everything I knew. One evening, just as twilight settled over the house, I found myself alone in the garden. The cool breeze a stark contrast to the warmth burning inside me. I closed my eyes, letting the wind brush against my face, feeling the weight of my own choices press down on me. How had I let things go so far? And yet, I couldn't deny the thrill of it, the way he made me feel, alive. As if I'd been sleepwalking all these years until he arrived and shook me awake. A quiet sound interrupted my thoughts, a familiar shuffle of footsteps on the garden path. I opened my eyes, finding him standing a few feet away, watching me with an expression that was both cautious and understanding. We didn't need words. The silence between us said everything. He moved closer, slow and careful, as if he feared any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment we'd built together. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, filled with genuine concern. I nodded, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know how to explain the turmoil within me, the whirlwind of emotions that had taken root and refused to let go. "I don't know," I finally whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. It was the closest I could come to admitting the truth, the only confession I could allow myself to make. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment I let myself lean into his touch, let myself feel the warmth and comfort he offered. It was a small gesture, a simple connection, but it felt monumental, like the final step toward something I couldn't undo. We stood there, the garden fading into shadows as dusk settled in, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine a life beyond the walls of my routine, a life where I was free to feel, to be. The fantasy was fleeting, but it was enough to remind me of what I truly wanted. Of what I'd been denying myself for so long. The moment stretched, each heartbeat a reminder of the line we'd crossed, the one we could never retreat from. And in his presence, under the blanket of night, I felt the full weight of my choices. The silence of the night settled around me as I stood in the dimly lit hallway, watching him disappear down the corridor. Every part of me felt torn between the life I had and the life I wanted. I knew that what we'd built in the quiet moments we'd stolen was fragile, like a glass teetering on the edge, ready to shatter at the slightest push. And yet, I couldn't imagine letting it go. The house was still, the kind of stillness that felt almost suffocating. My husband was upstairs, sleeping soundly, as if the foundation of our life wasn't crumbling beneath him. And I was here, stuck between worlds, haunted by choices that no longer felt like choices at all. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Just then, I heard a quiet creak behind me. I turned. And there he was, standing at the foot of the stairs, his face unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through to the parts of me I'd hidden away for so long. Without thinking, I took a step toward him, and he met me halfway, his expression shifting, softening. In that moment, I wanted to tell him everything. All the fears, the regrets, the quiet dreams I'd locked away. But the words wouldn't come. All that remained was silence, thick and heavy, filling the space between us. He reached out, his fingers grazing mine in a gentle, almost hesitant touch, and for one fleeting second, I thought I'd found my answer, but then a soft click echoed from upstairs, my husband's door opening. We both froze, caught in the harsh reality that neither of us could. I pulled my hand back, stepping away as the footsteps grew louder, each one a reminder of everything we'd built on fragile promises and quiet moments. And as the sound drew closer, I felt the full weight of my decision crash over me. When my husband reached the top of the stairs and looked down at us, his face unreadable, I knew there was no way to go back. I held my breath, waiting for something. An accusation, a question, a word. But he just looked at me, and in his silence, I saw everything he hadn't yet said.